Really, really appreciate you guys being here. My name is Miguel. I work on the Gateways and Connectors team, and we provide connectivity and gateway solutions, hybrid solutions, for all of the BAPI services under James' organization, including Power BI, analysis services, Power Apps Flow, Logic Apps, and so on. So in these sessions, we're going to focus on connectivity to SAP data sources using Power BI. We're going to do a quick overview of Power BI connectivity. I assume most of you are already using Power BI, so we'll kind of go a bit quickly on that. But because we're going to be talking about a few different pieces involving the desktop, the gateway, the service, and we're going to talk about things like pass-through of credentials, single sign-on, and those concepts, I want to kind of lay a little bit of a foundation so we're all on the same page when we talk about the actual connectors. Then we're going to go and cover both the current state and also the upcoming enhancements and roadmap for the two existing connectors we have, SAP HANA and SAP BW. How many of you are actually already using the connectors? The HANA connector and BW? So even more people. Okay, makes sense. That will make for a good session, I think. So here's the 10,000 feet overview of Power BI. Power BI is this great SaaS service sitting in that middle cloud that provides users the ability to interact with data, monitor data through dashboards and reports that were either created by somebody else using Power BI Desktop as the main report authoring tool and published into the service, or they were just out-of-the-box content. And there's the notion of the apps or content packs that you probably have heard about in Power BI. So that would be that first group with certain SaaS services that have predefined content that Power BI in cooperation with those other third parties have built and offer to you so that you can immediately get insights from that data without much effort. Now let's talk about the second scenario where you're actually using Power BI Desktop. That's the scenario that will apply as of today to something like SAP HANA or BW, where it is pretty much a very tailored solution to your organization, and someone will have to go and create those reports, publish them, and of course, because those data sources are on-prem, you'll have to configure gateways to get access from the Power BI service to actually either refresh data or to just bring the latest data when you're doing something like direct query consumption. Last but not least, you can access this data once it's in the Power BI service through either the Power BI mobile solutions or the website itself, powerbi.com. Talking a little bit about connectivity and data prep, we have connectivity to a wide range of data sources. We support 75 plus data sources in the desktop today. So this is kind of a snippet of each of the lists that you have organized by category of data source, like files, databases, Azure services, of course, being Microsoft BI solution. We have best connectivity to Azure. But there's not just those 75 that show up on the list. There's also way more that you can access because among those 75, we do have some connectors that allow you to connect through generic interfaces. So for example, we have ODBC connectors, we have OLEDB, we have OData, we have the web connector, which allows you to get to REST APIs as well. So even if the data source you're trying to connect to, it's not showing up in this list by itself, there's probably a way for you to connect to it already and enable it end-to-end through Power BI. On top of those connectors, we offer generally import, which is basically the ability to ETL data from that external data source into the Power BI data model, where you can then start enriching with additional measures, with relationships. Then you can create the visualizations on top. And for some of the connectors, we also provide direct query connectivity. So direct query, how many of you are familiar with direct query? Okay, pretty much all of you, but I'll do a quick recap. So in direct query mode, what you basically do is you bypass the extraction phase from that external data source. So rather than creating a cache copy in the Power BI data model, what's happening is that we only create in the data model the definition of the schema for all the entities, columns that you've brought in, even relationships, if they exist in the data source, they're also brought down to the metadata on that local model in Power BI. And then as you start using those fields and those entities in your report, maybe even creating a measure or actually using it on a report visualization, like a bar chart, for example, we're going to start requesting that data to be fetched from the underlying system. So for example, if you create something like a column chart that shows total sales by category when you're using direct query mode, we're actually going to reach back to that underlying data source, let's say SQL Server or let's say SAP HANA, and we're going to bring the aggregated data. So we'll do the group by operation in SQL, we'll push it down to the data source, you get the results back only with the final output. So rather than importing the entire data set and doing the aggregation locally, which is what you generally do with import mode. Besides the import and direct query modes, the other important key point to mention, kind of related to what I was talking about, standard interfaces, it's also the data connector extensibility SDK. So this is something that we just released a couple weeks ago. We covered it in an earlier session this morning about the data connector SDK, which basically allows you to create your own custom connectors. So even if you're trying to connect to something that doesn't show up in the list, you'd be able to go and configure it. So if you already have a REST API endpoint, if you have an OData service, if you have an ODBC or an ODB driver, you could actually create a connector on top using this SDK and easily plug it into Power BI Desktop and also distribute it to your users so that they can plug it in as well. And for them, it will just show up as another data source in this list in the desktop get data dialog. We're planning to expand that support to also include the on-premises data gateway, so that refreshes scenarios. Once you publish a report that uses that connector to the Power BI service, they'll fetch through the Power BI gateway, leverage that connector that has been deployed there as well to actually make it work end-to-end. The last 2 points here are about the overall get data capabilities. So we do offer lots of capabilities around data shaping and combining data from different data sources, doing things like joins or merge operations, doing things like appending multiple tables or unioning data. And the last point here is about the language itself. It's the Power Query formula language, which is also known as M, or officially known as M. It's a very powerful, both a language and also a query evaluation runtime, an engine that will actually take care of many different things for you. So for example, if you're working against a SQL Server database, and depending on the transforms that you're applying, say a filter, say you're applying a remove columns operation, we're actually going to end up translating that from the query editor UI into M code, and then that M code, when run in the M engine, will try and offload and push down as much of the query execution as it can to the underlying data source. And it will also try to do some optimizations along the way. So for example, if you're doing a row-by-row calculation in your query, and after that you're filtering by a specific column that reduces maybe your data set size to 10% of the rows, M will actually be smart enough to front load that filter operation in the generated SQL so that we don't overload the server with too many row-by-row operations for something that you're actually not using in your final output. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit about hybrid connectivity. As we said, in some cases when you build reports against on-prem data sources, you're actually going to have to use the Power BI or the on-premises data gateway. So this is kind of a high-level diagram. For the data that you need to still keep on-prem, you definitely can do that. You can use the on-prem data gateway to connect the service with the gateway. So you'd basically install the on-prem data gateway, register it with the Power BI service tied to your account, and from there you'd start registering the data sources that you'd like to access through that gateway and granting access to different users. There's two different modes for this gateway. There's enterprise mode and there's the personal mode. So in the personal mode is geared towards a single user who installs the gateway and then plugs their reports through that particular gateway. But there's also the enterprise scenario with the ability to manage ACLs, basically. So give a certain set of users access to a given gateway or not. And down the road, we also have capabilities around managing and monitoring the usage, who's seeing what, who is leveraging which gateway. Yeah, question? In terms of a gateway, I think the experience is the same as with other Power BI flavors. But yeah, it has many other reasons why you'd want to go use it there. The other thing I wanted to cover here is that when it comes to that on-premises data gateway, there's two different workloads that you can configure. There is the scheduled refresh or import-based workload where you can just schedule that data refresh that pushes back that cache data into the Power BI data model, in this case sitting in the cloud, not in the desktop. Or you can use direct query where, again, as someone interacts with your report, in this case in the Power BI service, we will issue the right queries to be sent through that gateway to the underlying data source to just get the aggregated data. In terms of investment going forward, of course, being in this SAP session, I need to highlight we're doing a lot of investment on SAP connectivity, about enriching our connectors and also about getting them certified with SAP. We have a close partnership with SAP around certification, and we also do work together in some specific customer engagements that are, of course, in best interest for both SAP and us to provide the best experience we can on top of SAP sources for Power BI. We're doing lots of investments on direct query. This implies both new data sources. So for instance, if you looked yesterday at the June desktop update for Power BI, the Power BI desktop update, we released a new connector for Netissa, IBM Netissa, which includes direct query as well. We also have others in the pipeline, things like Google BigQuery, that will include as well direct query. SAP BW direct query was also released yesterday. We're going to demo that in this session. Besides the new connectors or the new direct query capable connectors, we're also investing a lot in the direct query experience itself. So for example, getting better feedback from the tool when something is being refreshed on the data source, being able to cancel queries, being able to actually keep some of that data cached for some time, like within a session, so that there's not always the need to actually refresh back. And so for cases where the responsiveness of the underlying data source is not that good, it may take a few seconds or several seconds to actually bring that data back. So those are all things that we're trying to build in the UI so that the report consumption experience is optimized for low latency and quick interactivity. The next kind of bucket of things that we're working on, and this is something that if you've been to the Gateway session earlier today, it was demoed there as well, is enterprise gate capabilities like single sign-on. So we're thinking about single sign-on, Kerberos-based or Kerberos-constrained delegation on top of many different data sources, including things like SQL Server, Oracle, and of course, SAP HANA and SAP BW are also as part of that bucket. So it's something we'll invest in the future. Yes? Yeah, so the question is there any timeline for when we will offer single sign-on top of SAP HANA? Kerberos-based, I assume. So it's something we're actively working on, and we expect to put a preview out in a few months, hopefully. This is a particular scenario where we are running into an issue with the SAP HANA ODBC driver that Power BI uses behind the scenes, and we're working closely with the SAP team so that they can roll out a fix for the SAP driver that then we can deliver single sign-on Kerberos on top. And the last point here, again, extensibility and custom data sources being a big area of investment for our team in terms of allowing that third-party extensibility and enrichment of the connectivity options in Power BI. With that in mind, let's go into the SAP HANA connector. Let's start by covering the current state. So the SAP HANA connector today in Power BI depends on the SAP HANA ODBC driver. This is something that you can get from the SAP Software Management or Software Development Center, basically your SAP portal. And you need a login for that. I actually don't have a login for that, but someone else gets me the ODBC driver that I need. But once you have installed that driver, you're able to just connect to HANA seamlessly through our experience. It enables you basically to consume the information models, so analytic and calculation views. And it offers both import and direct query modes. Now, we're primarily treating HANA right now as a relational data source. So some of the concepts there in the SAP HANA source, we're not fully reflecting them in Power BI today. A couple of examples would be things like hierarchies. So we don't bring any hierarchy information through because we're just consuming tabular outputs through those views. And we also do not do quite well in terms of handling non-additive measures today. So an example of this would be if you're using indirect query mode and also in import actually. If you're using something like an average and you want to do like an aggregate of averages, we're just summing them. So just be aware of that. This is something that we plan to improve. So kind of looking ahead, we're going to greatly improve our HANA direct query mode to actually include multidimensional treatment of HANA. So basically treating HANA like a cube source and start respecting hierarchies. We're also going to be kind of pushing down the execution of those non-additive measures and measures in general to the underlying cube so that the logic, the right formulas will be applied at the cube level based on the right context for your query, for your aggregation. The other thing we mentioned already was the Kerberos-based single sign-on support that we're working on. So with that, let's go and look at the current SAP HANA connector. So I'm looking at Power BI Desktop. I'm going to go into Get Data. And the SAP HANA connector shows up under the database group. We have HANA and BW. So I need to provide my HANA server, which of course I don't remember by heart, because this is actually a HANA instance hosted in Azure. So that's the Cloud App URL. So we're going to use import in this mode. Note that if you actually knew exactly what you wanted to pull out of HANA and you had a SQL statement for it, you can just paste it here. So an example of this would be if you actually want to consume a raw table from HANA, you could actually pull it out through this mode, just by providing the SQL statement that does the select operation from there. If you don't do that and just click OK, we're going to try and connect. So the first thing that it asks me for is my credentials. We support both Windows and database credentials. I'm going to be using Windows, and here is my username and my password. We're going to be using database. So the next prompt you saw is about encryption. By default, Power BI will try to connect with encryption on to the underlying data source. In this case, that specific HANA server does not have encryption configured, so that we're asking you if you're OK with unencrypted. And once you pass, you get into the navigator experience. So this is pretty consistent with the experience you get on top of any other relational data source in Power BI Desktop, where you can browse all of the interesting objects. In this case, there is the different folders, and then I have the actual cubes. And when I go into one of them, I can actually start picking my dimensions and measures that I want to use. So after all, what you're doing here is selecting a bunch of items to build a single output, a single tabular output out of it. So for example, if I select my this about cars, so I get the car make and the model and the car style. I start picking those fields, and you see the output here on the bottom right. Let's also pick a couple of measures. We can pick the number of orders and the sales amount. Optionally, there's actually parameters you can specify. So I could go and subset just from here as a view parameter, optional parameter. I could have specified the value for the make, so that will filter that down. The same goes for style. In this case, they're both optional, but there might be cases in which these are required. And there's also cases where you get a lot of these values. So something that we added recently was the ability to filter these down by allowing you to show all parameters or just the required parameters. In this case, there's no required, but that will allow you to easily focus on the ones that are required if that's all you want to provide. And of course, as you provide one of them, you can click Apply to refresh this view. That will refresh the output with given those filters, those variables, values that you provide. So at this point, I can go ahead and let's actually click Edit. So if I were to click Load, we would now run the underlying SQL query that we're generating through this UI in HANA to actually extract the data, because we're using import, and we would cache that data locally. What I'm going to do instead of that is click Edit to get me into the query editor, where I can apply additional data transformations. And this experience is by and large the same as it is for all of the other data sources in Power BI, in Power Query in general. You get all of the same set of transformations. So for example, you could go in and apply a filter. So I can go to the style column and maybe exclude one of the styles. And it generates that filter, filters out SUV. There's something special though. Because we're working with a multi-dimensional source, you see that there's this new tab called Cube Tools Manage. And here is where you can come to actually add or remove items. So you could come here to bring an extra measure if you want it. And it will add that measure, and it will aggregate to that level that you're already in. So at this point is doing the margin by make, model, and style. But if I were to actually do something else, like for example, collapse the style, pay attention to the measure columns and the values, you see how they re-aggregate to that level. They change the values, or should change the value for the ones that are related. So that's at the high level the concept. You are selecting a bunch of dimensions, and then the measures get aggregated at the level based on the dimensions you picked. You can also filter by values within a given dimension. As you expand and collapse level, those measures get recalculated based on that context, because we regenerate the underlying SQL query and reevaluate in the source. There's also cases where you might end up doing a transformation that is not supported in the underlying data source. Let's see if I'm lucky enough and I can do one of those. So for example, let's try to transform something here. So we can do, let's see, uppercase probably. So uppercase doesn't actually have an equivalent underlying operation in SAP HANA. So in this case, we applied uppercase, and what happened is that we started compensating and evaluating locally because there's no support in the backend for that operation. So at this point, you notice how that additional cube tab that we had for cube tools to add and collapse dimensions is gone, because at this point we're out of that cube mode because we're already working with just the extract locally because of that operation. If I remove that last step, it comes back and I'm back to cube mode. So now we can go and close and apply that. And at this point, I already have my data cached locally in the model because I'm using import, so I can just do any type of Power BI visualization I want. So for instance, we can do the total sales amount, and we can do something like the total sales by car style. Okay, and maybe just for comparison, we can do another column chart, in this case, that shows also by car style, but we're going to look at the number of orders. Okay, so just to show a couple of examples there, and of course all of the other Power BI principles like cross-filtering and cross-highlighting, they all work the same way. At this point, it's agnostic from the underlying data, so you're just working with cache data in Power BI. Okay, so to kind of complete the continuum here, what I could do is just publish this report. So we're going to go and publish this. I need to save the changes first, and I'm going to call this my MDIS HANA report. And I'm going to pick a workspace. So now once it is published, we can go into the Power BI service, look at the report. It's going to be cached data at this point, and we need to configure refresh if we really wanted to do that. So kind of connecting back to the integration with the on-premises data gateway, now I need to go and configure my gateways, including the refresh capabilities. So here's the report. It's all the same data as in desktop, same experience. It's cached. We can go to Manage Gateways. Oh, I don't have any gateways. And from here, we could go and download, and then we would register that data source, that SAP HANA source, with that gateway, configure credentials. So here it is where you could specify the credentials, but they're a single set of credentials per gateway. So here is where, once we enable single sign-on, you'd be able to just do that pass-through of the user identity from Power BI to the underlying HANA system. Let's go back to the deck. Any questions on the HANA connector? Yep, couple. For tabular data out of HANA? No, right now we only support the analytic and calculation views. You could, through the SQL snippets, actually pull tables out. And if you actually wanted to expose a HANA tables connector to users in your organization, you could always leverage the custom connector SDK that I mentioned. So you could create a custom connector that maybe pulls 50, 60 different tables, each of them with a specific native statement, and just give that as a connector to your users. That would work desktop only right now, but we're working on gateway support. You had another question?
Yeah, is there a way to change the input parameters?
Yeah, so the input parameters, yes, they can be modified. That's a great question. But they can be modified only from Power BI desktop at this point. I see, got it. No, there's no way to do that. I encourage you to go both for that in user voice, because it's an area of internal discussion and prioritization as we talk about next semester investments.
Excuse me?
Yeah?
Do you have any plan for bringing the attribute views? So right now it supports only the calculation views.
Yep.
But if you bring the attribute views, it would be good to build a schema.
So yeah, great point. So we don't have immediate plans, but kind of the same approach that I was mentioning for tables could be used for the attribute views. And again, you can vote on ideas.powerbi.com so that we can kind of build in that support as well. Any more questions on HANA? Okay, so let's go talk about SAP BW. So here's the current state. We support SAP BW Server 7.x and higher, up to 7.5. We require the SAP NetWeaver RFC SDK to be installed first. So similar to the HANA case where we require the ODBC driver, here we require the RFC SDK. That's something you can download from the SAP software portal. The connector, this is actually out of date. Import mode only was the case until yesterday when we released the direct query mode in preview in Power BI Desktop. So at least you can now go and try direct query in the desktop. In terms of end-to-end support, we still don't support direct query in the on-premises data gateway. We support import only in that case. But it's something that is coming hopefully in the next month or two. The SAP BW connector allows you to connect to info cubes and query cubes, also to the VEX queries. And we support some rich SAP concepts like, for instance, display names and technical names. So you can turn on both, and as part of a navigator experience, you can see both names and easily search across both to find the right elements to select. And the last point here, as I was saying, on-prem data gateway support for refresh only, direct query coming in the next month or two. Looking ahead, we already talked about direct query being available in June, but as part of that, we're also making it such that we treat SAP BW as a multi-dimensional connector. We start propagating information like the hierarchies and the variables information. There's actually a better experience in the desktop to modify variables as part of direct query. I'm going to show you that as well than what you had before with import or what you have with HANA today. We are also making lots of improvements that accrue to both import and direct query, including things like exposing additional member properties. Today, if you use the BW connector, you realize that it only exposes the default caption for a given member, which it's probably the medium text. And you might be missing things like keys or short and long text. So we're planning to expose that also really soon. Today, you're only able to connect to the application server. You cannot point to a message server that generally you'd use for like load balancing. We're planning to add that support as well. And a couple other improvements would be things like SSO, like we mentioned, so Kerberos-based single sign-on, which has a pre-requirement to actually enable users to connect through Windows authentication. So that's also something we're planning to add to the desktop. So today, if you use the connector, you see that there's only basic auth, so username and password. We're adding Windows auth in the desktop as a stepping stone to support Kerberos-based single sign-on through the gateway in Power BI services scenarios. And last not least, which I also should have mentioned on the HANA case, we're working with SAP on getting the connector certified. Let's go in. Yeah?
The attributes question for HANA also is applicable for BW. Is there any, are you guys thinking about it as well or no?
Kind of the same deal. We don't have any immediate plans, but either through custom connectivity or by voting for us to prioritize a first-class support. Because, yeah, you could pull it with a custom MDX. In this case, in the BW case, we use MDX behind the scenes, so you could write the custom MDX query to pull them. Okay, let's go do a demo. In this case, I'm going to show you the new direct query connector that we released yesterday as a preview feature. Let me start a new Power BI desktop. So we go to get data. And under database, we have SAP BW. I'm going to provide my server name, the system number, the client ID. So this is the second option. Here is the new option that we added yesterday in the June release. So I'm going to select that. And as advanced options, you have the ability to provide a language code to connect to that server. So by default, we're actually going to use the current document locale, which gets generated as you create your new Power BI desktop report. In this case, because I'm using English operating system locale, we actually default to ENUS. If I had to switch this to not just the keyboard, but the actual OS locale to Spanish, it would use ESES. And then we would use that same locale as the default local or language code that we use to connect to the SAP underlying source. Now there's a mapping here between the SAP language codes and the locales that we support in Power BI. So we point you here to this document that actually has the full list of language codes supported by SAP BW. You could actually change that also on a per query basis, because the underlying code could also be modified in the query that we generate for each of the tables. So even if you want to connect to multiple cubes, maybe with different language codes, you could also do that through custom M code. You could go and override that code. And again, you can provide a statement, in this case an MDX statement, to pull something like attributes, or maybe if you have a specific query you want to run, you can also do that. Let's use direct query, and let's go connect. And in this case, as we were mentioning, we only support database credentials. We're planning to add Windows Auth as well. So let's do BI user, and my password. All right, so here is kind of the same experience as you saw with HANA earlier, where you can browse and actually select the interesting cube for you. So let's pick something like sales overview. But in this case, the experience is a little bit different. So before, if you remember what we did with HANA, or if you've used the import mode of a connector, you would get to select the cube and then actually expand that to pick specific dimensions and measures. In this case, we are only picking the cube level.
Are there any best practices for when you're doing this? I've noticed a tremendous variability in performance when you're doing the import for that attribute list to actually populate, along with kind of the filters.
Yes. So there's a couple things there. The lag that you're seeing is generally because you have either lots of metadata and lots of input parameters, or lots of cubes that you expose. One of the problems that we've had with the connector in the past, and I think it might either be fixed on the June release or will be fixed in the July one, is that we were pulling all of that metadata up front. So in this case, when I expanded this database level, we would actually pull the metadata for each of the cubes, including all of the metadata for each of the parameters, including also all of the input values. So if you had too many values to filter by, that could have slowed it down.
That's what we kind of narrowed down and had to create separate queries specifically for kind of Power BI consumption because of that.
Yeah, so we heard that feedback, and what we're doing is we're changing it so that we only pull the level here on the cube, and then as you select one of the cubes, we will go pull the parameter metadata values and all that.
We've also discovered that depending on how where the filters are at in your BW queries determines that too. If your filters are in the rows or just embedded in the free characteristics, significantly impacts performance.
Yes. Yep, good points. But yeah, generally speaking, we're trying to delay the retrieval of the metadata for individual cubes until you select that cube. And even further, the actual retrieval of the values will be done only when you click that little ... So in this case, as we were saying, the experience changes in that you do not select specific dimensions and measures. You only stay at the cube level. The preview also changes. In the other case, you were getting just a preview of the output table that you would get based on your selection. In this case, what you're actually seeing here, even though we show it as a table, it's a metadata table. So it's not like this is the table, the table output that you're going to get. But this is just a list of the different items that we found. So we found a bunch of dimensions. We also found a few measures here. So you can see by the kind, you see measure and dimension, and here's the names and the actual IDs for each of those items. Okay, so kind of the same experience with parameters. In this case, they're optional. Another big difference, you can only click load. There's no edit experience. This is much more similar to the analysis services live experience that you have already, if you want to think about it that way, in that you're connecting to a remote cube and you have the definition of all of your dimensions, measures, hierarchies there in that cube. You're not doing any data transformations, you're not extracting data. So it's something that we kind of model after that, and from there we plan to grow both in terms of capabilities, like for instance, combining data with other data sources outside of SAP BW is something that we're looking into for the future as well. So think about that with that particular model in mind, and if you're already using AS Live, you'll find this experience very familiar. So for example, now you can go into seeing your key figures, and we have here something like build quantity. So let's go and add that. And you see in this case there's a lag. You see the little spinner, and it came back. So that's the time that it took to actually issue that total build quantity, or the sum of build quantity measure, issued the request from my Power BI desktop through the NetWeaver RFC SDK and into my actual SAP BW Cube, which happens to be running in Germany, I think. So it took, about a second or two to come back. It's kind of an easy query. You'll see that as I do something more complex, it may take longer, but that's kind of a current state, so I'll repeat that. There's that one. So let's do something else, a bit more complex. We can look at also the build quantity, but in this case, we're going to look at it by distribution channel. So, and you see how we're spinning, and in this case, it may take a bit longer to come back, but that's the data, so everything else you can do here, maybe do a sort. We're also going to sort in the data source, so you see also a little bit of a delay there.
So it's not cached?
No, it is not cached. That's one of the improvements that I was referring to with direct query enhancements, in terms of like improving the logic for when to cache what, and especially at design time, you might want to say, okay, cache some data now, I'll just build the interactions, make it responsive, and then for the actual consumption, you might want to turn that off, or maybe change the time to live for those caches. So they're all improvements we're looking at for the next few months as well, in terms of direct query, which wouldn't be specific to BW, but just general direct query experience improvements. Let me try and build another one. This one is flaky because of connecting to that remote SAP BW server, and it actually pulls a lot of data. But if you look at this country table here, we have a couple of hierarchies. So let's see if we're lucky and we can build a good hierarchy-based drill-down visual here. So I just pulled the PM country here. Let's move it to location, and let's add the levels 2 and level 3. And I'm going to turn this into a column chart. So you see how I get, because I'm working with that hierarchy, I get all of the drill-down experience. And I'm going to add just one measure. Let's say, again, build quantity. We'll add that to the value. So from here, we can just go, and it's a regular drill-down experience. Maybe we don't have enough good values, but I think you get the point that we're actually, because we're using that hierarchy, we are actually able to just capture everything from the source. And of course, it's just, it's just a pass-through of that hierarchy definition. So next time you come back, if there's an extra level that has been added to the hierarchy, you could just come in and it will show up for you. It's not like we are duplicating the definition in here or anything. Okay, so that was kind of an overview of the SAP BW direct query connector that we just shipped. We have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open for Q&A. Yes?
On your enhancements on the BW connector, what's your timeline? 3 months, 6 months?
In general, we're looking at 6 months here. Now we're hopeful that many of the things will be in the next 3 months, but we're not making a hard statement around that. But yeah, some of the things are already there. Some others will come in next month or two. We follow a very incremental approach on this. The one that will be longer running would be the SAP certification one, just because we're holding off until we finish the other critical enhancements to get that kicked off. Yeah?
Sometimes, do you know, when you're doing a BW connection and doing an import,
Mm-hmm.
and you're actually in Query Editor,
Mm-hmm.
there are some queries that we connect to where in the applied steps, the added items, the
Yep.
spoke does not appear to go add other items. So you have to add a complete other step into it.
Okay, interesting. Did you happen to have modified the M formula by hand?
Nope.
Okay,
No,
we.
it's some queries, some work fine. Others we've noticed when you connect, right away you don't get that.
Okay.
Kind of the edit of the added item.
You have a consistent repro for that? You have a way to repro that consistently, like you. Okay, we should take that offline. We should look at that.
And I guess the question is, are there any like best practices that you guys have established on how to set up your BW queries so that they're optimized for Power BI consumption?
It really depends on what you want to optimize for. If you're optimizing for the flexibility of configuring things for the report author, you may want to throw in additional knobs like additional parameters. If you're trying to optimize for best or lowest latency in actually that design experience, you might want to have less input parameters. So kind of what we were discussing earlier. You should also optimize for lower latency evaluation of the query itself so that the response time in interacting with the visuals is lower. So that's kind of the first level. Now the second level, once we add something like the ability to connect through a message server, you could also be able to use that to actually load balance across different BW instances that you want to connect to. Setting aside BW, there's in general the ability to just load balance between gateways, which is something that we're working on for the future, for the next few months. So there's a few, you can optimize your reports at a few different levels in terms of the latency. But yeah, we anticipate latency is going to be a critical aspect of configuring BW because of the nature of the data source and usually the load that those servers are under, in general because of how widely used they might be in your organization. And we also recommend to keep up to date with the latest SAP nodes. We work through the NetWeaver interface. We use the MDX interface, the BAPI interface. So all the nodes that you can find related to performance improvements. We also have a long list. We're happy to share that with you. But we've seen dramatic differences in performance when we talk to some customers running, let's say, BW 7.3 compared to 7.5 with the latest SAP nodes. Yeah. So there is in the Business Objects Design tool, the Business Explorer tool, when you connect to a query or when you configure a query, there's an option there that says allow third-party tools or expose to third-party tools. So you need to check that. And then once that's installed, that's enabled, you come to Power BI and you're able to find it in the navigator. I believe it's off by default. More questions? Yes, sir?
So HANA views have kind of the actual column name and then filter text selected version.
Okay.
Is there any way for that on the roadmap to also bring in that kind of overall text or alt text?
Yeah, so as part of the improvements to deliver that new HANA data query that treats it as a multidimensional source, we plan to also expose the additional member properties in SAP HANA. Anyone? Yeah?
Does this work against all types of code?
Sorry?
Does it work against all types of code views in BW?
Uh, It wouldn't, out of the box, give you that list of items, but you'd be able to write through MDX to pull that data through.
About the Power BI service, so when you're developing that Power BI desktop, you have the NetWeaver files installed.
Uh-huh.
Do you publish with any other trick that you actually have on the service?
No, you would just publish the report, and then once you configure the gateway, the machine that's running the gateway would need to have the same. So yeah, watch out also there for differences in bitness. So keep in mind that the on-premises data gateway we release in 64-bit only, while desktop is both 32 and 64. So just make sure to install the right version, because if you put the 32-bit DLLs in the gateway machine, it won't work. And you would say, oh, well, it's the same ones that I'm using in desktop, but there might be different bitness. Okay, we have a couple more minutes. If not, then I'll let you guys go. I'm the last thing between you and your afternoon coffee. So thank you so much.